For 412 days, the Duke of Renfield walked past his wife in the hallways of his own house, as though she were a portrait bolted to the wall. He never raised his voice to her. He never spoke a cruel word. He simply looked through her the way a man looks through a window he has stopped noticing and called it peace. Then one gray morning, she stopped waiting for him to look back. And that more than anything he had ever done to her, was the moment his whole world cracked open. "Hello, lovely? If you're settling in for another quiet evening with a cup of tea and a story to lose yourself in, I am so glad you're here. If tales like this one bring you a little comfort, a like or a subscribe means more than you know. It helps this channel keep bringing you these slow-burn stories of love found in the coldest of houses. And if you have a moment, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and they always make me smile. Now, settle in, because this one is going to break your heart before it mends it. Chapter 1. The contract. Nathaniel Gray, the 7th Duke of Renfield, did not attend his own wedding breakfast for love. He attended it because his father had left behind a title, heavy with debt, and a family name that had begun to smell of desperation in the drawing rooms of London. He was 28, tall in the way that made rooms go quiet when he entered them, and utterly, deliberately empty behind the eyes. He had chosen his bride the way a man chooses a horse for a long journey: sound, reliable, unlikely to cause trouble. Lady Charlotte Pierce was the daughter of a wool merchant who had clawed his way into minor gentility through decades of unglamorous, relentless work. Her dowry was substantial. Her manners were impeccable. Her face, by the cruel arithmetic of the ton, was called plain often enough that she had stopped flinching at the word by the time she was 19. Nathaniel did not marry her for her face. He barely looked at it during the ceremony. He said his vows to a point somewhere above her left shoulder. The way a soldier recites an oath he has already decided means nothing to his own heart, and when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, he offered his arm to her with the same courtesy he might have offered a stranger at a dinner party. Charlotte noticed. Of course she noticed. She had spent her whole life noticing the things people tried not to say out loud, and on her wedding day, what her new husband did not say was louder than any insult could have been. That night, in the vast, cold splendor of Renfield House, he came to her chamber only long enough to inform her of the terms. She would have the title. She would have every material comfort a duchess could want. She would never be asked to pretend affection she did not feel, because he would offer none of his own. In return, she would give him an heir, manage his household with competence, and never embarrass him in society. "I do not require your love, Lady Renfield," he said, standing in the doorway with his hand already on the latch. "I require your discretion." Then he was gone, and Charlotte sat alone on the edge of a bed built for two, listened to his footsteps fade down a corridor that suddenly felt 1,000 miles long. She did not cry. She had promised herself, on the carriage ride to the church, that she would not give this cold, beautiful stranger the satisfaction of her tears. So she sat very straight and she folded her hands in her lap, and she told herself that a marriage without love was still a marriage worth surviving. She had no idea, that first night, just how long survival would take. Chapter 2. The Art of Being Invisible. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm so precise it might have been drawn up by an architect. Breakfast in silence if he appeared at all. A curt nod in the hallway. Dinner where Nathaniel spoke perhaps a dozen words, most of them concerning the weather or the state of the roads. And then, every evening without fail, the study door closing behind him with a soft final click that Charlotte came to dread more than any slammed door ever could have. She tried, in those early months, the way any hopeful young bride tries. She arranged small dinners and invited the few families in the county whose company might have pleased him. He attended out of duty and left the moment propriety allowed. She asked after his day. He answered in single syllables. She touched his sleeve once, lightly, as they walked together through the winter garden, and he went so rigid beneath her fingers that she never attempted it again. The staff at Renfield House watched all of this with the particular sympathy servants reserve for a mistress they have come to respect. Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper, a stout woman with a face like a closed book that occasionally cracked open to reveal surprising warmth, took to bringing Charlotte's tea herself rather than sending a maid. Simply so the Duchess might have one more moment of someone's genuine attention in her day. "You mustn't let it hollow you out, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield said once, setting down the tray with more care than the task required. "Some men are just built like locked doors. Doesn't mean there's nothing behind them. Just means they've forgotten where they put the key." Charlotte had smiled at that, the polite, practiced smile she had perfected for exactly these moments, and said nothing. But she thought about it long after Mrs. Whitfield had gone, turning the words over like a stone in her palm, wondering whether it was kindness or simply a comfortable lie. She stopped waiting for dinner conversation that would never come. She stopped lingering in corridors at the hour he might pass. She began instead to fill the long, echoing hours of her days with anything that was hers alone. She found the old pianoforte in the unused morning room, its keys yellowed with disuse, and she began to play. Not the simple, unthreatening pieces her governess had once approved of, but the difficult ones, the ones that demanded something from her, the ones that let her pour every unspoken word into the keys instead of into the silence of her marriage. She started walking, too, further and further from the house each day, until her walks led her into the village of Ashdown, where the cottages sagged and the children ran barefoot in autumn mud, and where no one called her plain or invisible or a merchant's overpriced daughter. There, she was simply Lady Renfield, the woman with kind eyes who had begun asking the schoolmistress if there was any way she might be useful. There was. There always is, for a woman determined enough to be useful. Chapter 3. The Grey Lady. By the time the first snow fell that year, the villagers of Ashdown had given her a name of her own, one that had nothing to do with the husband who barely spoke to her. They called her the Grey Lady, for the plain woolen cloak she wore on her visits, and for the quiet way she arrived and departed, asking nothing in return for what she gave. She had used a portion of her personal allowance, money her father had settled on her before the wedding, and which Nathaniel had never once inquired after, to buy slates and primers for the children who had never held a book that was truly their own. She sat with the elderly in their cottages on afternoons when the wind howled loud enough to make solitude unbearable. She organized a Sunday gathering in the old chapel hall where anyone who wished to learn their letters might come, regardless of age, and within a season 6 students had become 20. She never told Nathaniel. It never occurred to her that he would care to know, and some stubborn, wounded part of her did not want to give him the chance to dismiss it the way he dismissed everything else that came from. The Duke, for his part, noticed her absences the way a man notices a draft in an old house, without quite understanding its source. The corridors of Renfield felt different when she was gone for the afternoon, though he could not have said how. Meals felt longer. The silence at dinner, once a comfort he had cultivated so carefully, began to feel less like peace and more like a room with all the air let out of it. He told himself it meant nothing. He had built his entire adult life on the conviction that meaning nothing was the safest way to live. Ever since he had watched his own father waste away in grief after his mother's death, a man so thoroughly undone by love that he could not manage an estate, could not raise a son, could barely rise from his chair some mornings, Nathaniel had decided, somewhere in the wreckage of that childhood, that he would rather feel nothing at all than risk becoming that kind of ruin. So when his steward mentioned, almost in passing one afternoon, while reviewing the estate ledgers, that the roof of the old schoolhouse in Ashdown had been repaired, and the new well dug near the chapel had been paid for by an anonymous benefactor, the villagers called their Grey Lady, Nathaniel felt something shift in his chest that he refused to name. "Do we know who this benefactress is?" he asked, more sharply than he intended. His steward, a careful man who had learned not to speculate where his employer's temper was concerned, only shrugged. "Some lady from the manor, Your Grace, or so they say, keeps to herself, doesn't want thanking." Nathaniel did not ask again. But that evening, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he found himself watching his wife across the dinner table instead of past her, noting the faint traces of mud at the hem of her gown, the ink stains at the edge of her glove that she had not quite managed to scrub away, the quiet, unreadable calm that had replaced the hopeful, searching looks she used to give him. He told himself it meant nothing. He was becoming very good at lying to himself, though not nearly as good as he believed. Chapter 4. Stranger at the piano. The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday in early spring, carried in by the butler on a silver tray as though it were any other correspondence, though it would change the course of everything that followed. It was from a composer named Edmund Ferris, a man of modest fame who had, by some quirk of fate, been traveling through the county the previous autumn and had stopped at a small gathering in Ashdown where Charlotte, persuaded by the schoolmistress, had reluctantly agreed to play. He wrote that he had not been able to forget her performance, that there was something in the way she played it that reached past technical skill into something rarer, something he wished to build upon. He proposed a collaboration, a piece for pianoforte, composed specifically for her, drawing on old folk melodies of the region, to be performed as a benefit for the very schoolhouse she had quietly funded. He asked only that she consider it, and that she allow him to call. Charlotte read the letter 3 times before she permitted herself to feel the small, unfamiliar flutter of excitement it produced. She had spent so long being unseen in her own home that the idea of someone noticing her, truly noticing the thing she had built out of loneliness and stubbornness, felt almost indecent in its warmth. She wrote back that afternoon, before she could talk herself out of it. Edmund Ferris arrived a fortnight later, a man in his middle 30s with ink-stained fingers and an easy, unguarded way of speaking that Charlotte had almost forgotten existed between two people. He treated her ideas as though they mattered. He asked her opinion and waited, genuinely, for her answer. He laughed at things she said, not politely, but as though she had actually amused him. The rehearsals began the following week, held in the very morning room where Charlotte had first taught herself to disappear into music instead of grief. Edmund arrived each morning with new pages of composition, and the two of them worked through the afternoons, arguing gently over phrasing, laughing over mistakes, filling a room that had known nothing but silence with something that sounded, for the first time in a year and more, like life. Nathaniel noticed this too. He noticed the sound of laughter drifting from the morning room when he passed the corridor outside it, a sound so unfamiliar in his own house that it stopped him mid-stride the first time he heard it. He noticed the way his wife's face had begun to soften into something bright and unguarded whenever Mr. Ferris was announced. He noticed, with a slow, creeping dread he did not yet have a name for, that his wife had begun to look like a woman in the process of falling in love, and that he had done absolutely nothing to earn the version of her that had once looked at him the very same way. He stood in the shadow of that corridor one afternoon, unseen, and watched through the half-open door as Edmund leaned close to point something out on the sheet music, his hand resting easily on the back of Charlotte's chair. And Nathaniel felt something twist so violently in his chest that he had to grip the doorframe to steady himself. It had a name, that feeling, though he refused for several more days to speak it even inside his own head. It was jealousy, raw and undignified, the kind of feeling he had spent his entire adult life building walls against, and it had arrived, uninvited and unstoppable, precisely because he had spent a year handing his wife's attention to anyone patient enough to want it. Chapter 5. The Confrontation. His aunt, Lady Prudence Ashworth, a widow of formidable opinions who had taken up residence at Renfield after her husband's death, and had never once been shy about sharing those opinions, found him 3 days later brooding over unread correspondence in his study. "Your wife is planning a public performance," she announced without preamble, settling into the chair across from his desk as though she owned it. "In the village, with that composer who's been coming round every day for a month." Nathaniel did not look up from his papers. "I am aware. Are you? Because from where I sit, you've noticed nothing about that woman in over a year except the sound of the door closing when she leaves a room." His jaw tightened. "That is not your concern, Aunt Prudence. It is entirely my concern, because I have watched you turn a warm, hopeful young woman into a ghost in her own home, and now you have the audacity to sit there sulking, because some ink-stained composer had the sense to notice what you were too proud to see." She rose, smoothing her skirts with brisk, unforgiving efficiency. "She deserves a husband who sees her, Nathaniel. If you cannot be that man, you ought to let her go and find someone who can. Do not skulk about jealous of a decent man simply because you have spent a year handing her every reason to stop hoping for you." The words landed exactly where she intended them to, and Nathaniel sat alone in his study long after she had gone, staring at the cold hearth, feeling something in his carefully constructed composure begin at last to give way. He found Charlotte in the garden that evening, seated on the stone bench near the roses, a book open and unread in her lap. She did not look up when his shadow fell over her. "I have heard about the performance," he said. "Have you?" Her voice was calm, careful, a voice he did not recognize as belonging to the woman he had married, in the village, with Mr. Ferris. "Yes." She closed her book slowly, at last meeting his eyes, and what he saw there was not the eager hope of a bride waiting to be noticed. It was something steadier, something that unsettled him far more. "I am to play a piece he has written for me. The villagers are looking forward to it. I did not think you would object, given you have shown no interest in anything I have done for the better part of 2 years." "I am not objecting." "Then what are you doing here?" "Your Grace?" The formal title struck him harder than an insult would have. He had asked for that distance himself, on their wedding night, and now it sat between them like a wall of his own making. "I am asking," he said slowly, "whether you are happy." Something flickered across her face, surprise perhaps, or disbelief, quickly smoothed away. "Happy," she repeated. "I have built a school. I have friends in the village who value my company. I have found something to do with my days besides waiting for a husband who does not want me in his. I am, Your Grace, as content as a woman in my situation can reasonably expect to be." "That is not an answer. It is the only one I have to give you." She rose, brushing invisible dust from her skirts, her composure a wall he suddenly, desperately wanted to break through. "You had your chance to ask me that question a year ago, Nathaniel. You did not ask it then. I am not certain you have any right to ask it now." She walked away before he could find the words to stop her, and he stood alone among the roses, watching her go, understanding at last, with the sick clarity of a man waking from a very long sleep, exactly what he had thrown away. Chapter 6. The weight of silence. He did not sleep that night. He walked the corridors of his own house like a stranger in it, pausing outside the door of the chamber he had not entered in over a year, his hand raised to knock and then lowered again, each time defeated by the same cowardice that had built the wall between them in the first place. What could he possibly say to her? That he was sorry, that he had watched his father dissolve into grief after his mother's death, and had decided, at 15 years old, standing at a graveside he barely understood, that love was simply too dangerous a thing to risk, that he had married a kind, clever woman, and had spent a year punishing her for a wound she had never inflicted, that he had been afraid every single day of their marriage, of exactly the thing that had now happened, of wanting her, of needing her, of losing the careful, hollow control he had spent his whole life building around himself like armor. He thought of his mother's portrait, still hanging in the long gallery, a woman with a soft, warm face and eyes that had once looked at his father the way Charlotte used to look at him before he had taught her to stop. He thought of his father, in the years after, wandering the same halls Nathaniel now paced, undone by a grief so total it had swallowed the man whole. He had spent his entire life terrified of becoming that. And in his terror, he had become something perhaps worse, a man who had never risked loving at all, and had broken someone anyway. The performance was 3 days away. He spent those 3 days the way a man prepares for battle. He knows he cannot win by strength alone. He wrote letters he tore up before finishing. He rehearsed apologies in the mirror of his dressing room, hearing how hollow they sounded even to his own ears, and abandoned everyone. He watched his wife across the dinner table each evening, saying nothing, wanting to say everything, paralyzed by the enormity of all the words he had never learned how to speak. On the morning of the performance, Aunt Prudence found him standing in the stable yard, already dressed for travel though. The village hall was barely 2 miles distant. "You look like a man riding into a war he started himself," she observed. "I believe I am." "Good," she said, not unkindly. "It is about time you fought for something instead of hiding from it." Chapter 7. What the music said. The village hall of Ashdown had been transformed for the occasion. Garlands of late spring flowers strung along the rafters, benches borrowed from the chapel arranged in careful rows. Half the county crowded in to hear the piece the mysterious gray lady had helped compose. Charlotte sat at the pianoforte, in a gown of soft green silk, her hair simply arranged, looking, Nathaniel thought as he slipped quietly into the back of the hall, entirely unlike the invisible, overlooked bride he had married, and entirely like the woman she had always been underneath, waiting for someone patient enough to see her. Edmund Ferris stood near the small assembled orchestra, his violin in hand, and when he caught Charlotte's eye and smiled, Nathaniel felt the old ugly jealousy rear up in his chest, and forced himself, for the first time in his adult life, not to run from the feeling, but to simply stand still and let it hurt. The music began softly, a single melody drawn from an old folk tune Nathaniel recognized from his own childhood, one his mother used to hum while working in the garden, long before grief had emptied the house of every song. Charlotte's hands moved across the keys with a grace that stole the breath from his chest. She was not merely playing notes. She was telling the truth of 2 years, every unspoken word, every quiet evening spent alone, every hope she had folded away, and every small, stubborn act of building a life out of a marriage that had given her nothing. He had never seen her like this. Luminous, entirely present, free of the careful, guarded stillness she wore in his presence like armor of her own. The piece built toward its final movement, the melody resolving into something warmer, something that sounded impossibly like forgiveness not yet given but perhaps, someday, within reach. When the final chord faded, the hall erupted into applause, villagers on their feet calling her name, the schoolmistress weeping openly into her handkerchief, and Charlotte rose from the bench with tears on her own cheeks, overwhelmed by an audience that had finally truly seen her. Nathaniel did not applaud. He could not move at all. He stood at the back of the hall unnoticed and understood with total, devastating clarity that he had spent 2 years failing to give this woman a single moment of the attention a room full of strangers had just given her freely. He turned and walked out into the evening before she could see him, unable to bear the thought of approaching her, surrounded by the very warmth he had denied her for so long. She found him an hour later, sitting alone on the stone bench in the garden of Renfield House, his head bowed, his hands clasped between his knees. "Your Grace." Her voice when she spoke held no anger, only a weary sort of curiosity. He looked up. His eyes were red, though he could not have said whether it was grief or shame, or simply the exhaustion of finally feeling something after 2 years of practiced numbness. "You were magnificent," he said. The words seemed to catch her off guard. She had expected silence, she told him later, or indifference, the same cold distance she had grown used to. Not this. Not him, sitting in the dark, telling her she was magnificent as though the word cost him something to say. "I did not think you would come," she said carefully. "I almost did not." He rose slowly, moving toward her the way a man approaches something he fears might startle and flee. "But I could not stay away. I have not been able to stay away for weeks, Charlotte, not since I first heard you laughing in that morning room with a stranger and understood I had no right to feel what I felt. What did you feel?" "Everything," he said, and the admission seemed to cost him more than any battle he had ever fought. "I felt it watching you with Mr. Ferris. I felt it tonight, watching you become something extraordinary without a single ounce of help from me. I have spent our entire marriage terrified of feeling anything at all, because I watched my father drown in grief after my mother's death, and I decided as a boy that love was too dangerous a thing to survive. So I built a wall instead, and I put you on the other side of it, and I called it peace." Charlotte's throat tightened. "You never told me that. I never told anyone that." He took a breath and she watched him gather a courage she had never once seen him need before. "I do not expect you to forgive me. I do not expect you to love me. I have given you no reason to. But I want you to know that I see you now, Charlotte. I see the woman who plays as though her whole heart is in her hands. I see the woman who built a school for children no one else thought worth teaching. I see you, and I am in awe of what you have become despite me, not because of me." The tears she had been holding back all evening slipped free at last. "You hurt me," she whispered. "For 2 years you made me feel as though I did not exist at all." "I know." He reached for her, his hands hovering just above her arms, as though asking permission he had never before thought to ask. "I know, and I am more sorry than I have the words to say. I have wasted 2 years I will never get back. 2 years of watching you fade when I should have been watching you bloom." She did not pull away. She stood very still, her heart pounding, waiting, the way she had waited so many times before, for a version of him that had never come. "I do not know if I can trust this," she admitted. "Too much silence has passed between us." "Then let me earn it," he said. "Not with words. I know words mean little after so long. Let me earn it with time, with actions." with every ordinary day that follows this one, until you believe me. Asterisk chapter 8. Learning to stay, she did not answer him that night with a declaration, and he did not ask for one. Instead, something far more fragile and far more real began between them, a slow, deliberate unlearning of 2 years spent as strangers under the same roof. He began attending her Sunday lessons in Ashdown, awkward at first, unused to sitting on a low bench among children half his height, but persistent in a way that surprised her more than any grand gesture could have. He learned the names of her students. He funded, without being asked, the expansion of the schoolhouse into a proper building with real desks and a real library. And when Charlotte thanked him for it, he told her quietly that it was not a gift to her, but an apology to every version of herself he had failed to notice. He canceled meetings in London that he would once have considered unmissable, simply to walk with her in the garden each morning and listen, truly listen, to whatever she wished to tell him about her day. He asked her opinion on estate matters he had never before thought to share, and found, to his genuine astonishment, that her judgment was sharper and more practical than his own. He told her, slowly, in fragments over many quiet evenings, about his father's grief, about the funeral he had stood through at 15, without shedding a single tear, because he had already decided that tears were a door he refused to open, about the years of cold, careful numbness he had mistaken for strength. Charlotte listened to all of it, and she did not rush to forgive him, because forgiveness given too quickly, she had learned, was not truly forgiveness at all. But she let the wall between them come down one stone at a time, the way it had been built, slowly, deliberately, with patience she had not known she still possessed. Edmund Ferrars, to his credit, saw the change in the Duke and Duchess of Renfield long before society did, and one afternoon, as their collaboration on a second composition drew to its natural close, he took Charlotte's hand and told her plainly that he had hoped once that something more might grow between them, but that he was glad, genuinely glad, to have been wrong. "He is trying," Charlotte admitted, "in ways I never thought he was capable of." "Then let him," Edmund said kindly. "Not every story needs to end with the composer, Duchess. Some of them simply need the right audience to finally listen." He left Ashdown a fortnight later, with warm regard and no bitterness, and Charlotte stood at the gate of the schoolhouse watching his carriage disappear down the lane, feeling something settle quietly into place inside her. Not loss, but a kind of gentle certainty about where her future truly belonged. Asterisk chapter 9. The second wedding. It was Aunt Prudence, in the end, who suggested the idea, half in jest, over breakfast one autumn morning nearly a year after the night in the garden. "You two never had a proper wedding," she said, buttering her toast with brisk efficiency. "Not one either of you actually wanted. Seems to me a couple who have finally learned to love each other might deserve the chance to say those vows again, this time meaning every word of them." Nathaniel took the suggestion more seriously than anyone expected. He proposed it to Charlotte one evening in the garden, on the very bench where he had first begun to earn her trust back, and this time he knelt, not out of ceremony, but because he wanted, badly, for her to understand that everything he was about to say came from a place words alone could never fully carry. "I cannot undo the 2 years I wasted," he said, "but I would like the chance to marry you again, properly this time, meaning every vow I speak. Not out of debt or duty, but because I love you, Charlotte, more than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone." The small ceremony took place in the same chapel in Ashdown, where she had taught a generation of village children their letters, filled not with the glittering, indifferent crowd of London society, but with the schoolmistress and Mrs. Whitfield and Aunt Prudence and 24 children who had grown to adore their gray lady long before they knew she was also their Duchess. Nathaniel spoke his vows this time looking directly into his wife's eyes, his voice steady and certain, and when he slid the ring onto her finger, his hands did not shake, because for the first time in his life, he was entirely, unguardedly sure of what he wanted. They danced that evening in the village hall, the very room where she had once played her heart bare before a crowd, and this time, when the music swelled, he did not stand at the back watching from the shadows. He held her, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he very nearly lost and refuses ever to take for granted again. "I used to think love was the most dangerous thing in the world," he murmured against her hair as they turned slowly beneath the lantern light. "I was wrong. the most dangerous thing in the world is a man too afraid to reach for it. Charlotte smiled against his shoulder, the tears she had once cried alone in a cold, silent bedroom finally, fully replaced by something warmer. "Then I suppose," she said softly, "we shall simply have to spend the rest of our lives being brave together." Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had fallen in love, Charlotte would tell them, with a smile that still carried the memory of every long, silent evening she had once endured, that their father had ignored her for 2 years, and that it had taken her walking away from waiting for him before he finally truly learned how to stay. And Nathaniel, listening from the doorway, would only add quietly that the greatest mistake of his life had been believing that silence could ever be mistaken for peace. If Charlotte and Nathaniel's story warmed your heart tonight, I would be so grateful for a like. It truly helps this channel find more hearts like yours. Subscribe if you'd like to join us for our next journey into love found in unexpected places. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to stop waiting for someone before they finally saw you? I read every single comment, and I love hearing how these stories find their way into your own lives. Until next time, remember, you were never invisible. You were simply waiting for someone brave enough to finally look.